Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the OPS webinar on the changes that are going to come into effect regarding the changes to eligibility for red diesel. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Steve Baxter, and I'll be your host for today. Before we kick off with the webinar itself, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the control panel you have on the right-hand side of your screen. You may have noticed already that your microphone is muted. Everybody's microphone is muted. This is so we don't get a lot of background noise and feedback throughout the webinar. If you want to make any comments that aren't particularly questions, you can use a chat box again in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Today's webinar should last about 30 minutes, including the Q&A session at the end. And the question that everybody always asks, can you get a copy of the presentation? Yes, absolutely, you can. It'll be emailed automatically to everybody who's registered for the webinar, or during this webinar, you can actually download it from the handouts section of the control panel on the right of your screen. Okay, so let's kick off. We're here to talk today about the changes that are coming to the eligibility of businesses to use red diesel. That is diesel with the reduced rate of duty. So at the moment, that's diesel where the duty is 11 pence per litre instead of 58 pence per litre. So our agenda for today then, just to have a quick look at what we're going to go through, we're starting off with a very quick discussion on the consultation process that is going on about these changes. Then we're going to detail what the changes actually are. Then a little bit on the dreaded penalties that the Exchequer is being allowed to levy. It's also worth discussing the reasons the changes are being brought in, and there are at least two ways of looking at that, as you'll see. Then we'll tackle one of the most important parts of the webinar today, the problems with the proposal, because you're going to discover that it's being implemented in what strikes us as a very strange way indeed. Then the most critical section, I suppose, is your actions. What are you going to have to do to comply with these changes, and what can you do to minimize their impact on your business? And finally, we'll finish off with a share and solve session. It'll actually not work quite as well as it would normally because we're doing this through a webinar as opposed to a face-to-face presentation, but you'll get the idea of how we do that kind of thing. Okay, so on we go. So the most important thing to remember at this stage, as of today, at the end of September, is that we're talking about proposals at the moment. Now, it's highly unlikely that the government will change its mind completely and drop the entire plan. But there are aspects of the proposals that we might be able to influence, and there are certainly some aspects that you would want to influence. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. The government's proposals for these changes to red diesel were only published in July this year, and you can download the original document if you want to read it from our website, and again you'll be able to use that link when you download the handout. So they're not giving us much time to respond at all. The deadline is the 1st of October. So July to October, during the middle of the COVID crisis, that's not giving people an awful lot of time to respond. Now, if you were going to be a skeptic, you might start thinking maybe that's a way for them to make sure they don't get many responses. And if you think that, then, well, you'd have to also say that it's working quite well, because there is hardly any news about this subject. When the proposals first came out and were discussed in March, and then the proposals came out in July, there was a little bit of news about it in the trade press, but really nothing else at all. So it's been very quiet indeed, but you're going to see it's well worth responding. And we've created the resources to make it really quick and easy for you to respond to these proposals. It'll take 30 minutes tops. So please do respond, and we hope that we'll be able to influence what the final regulations become. And there'll be more details on those a little bit later in the presentation. So obviously, key thing, what are the proposed changes to eligibility for red diesel? First of all, only 3 industry sectors will remain eligible for red diesel. Those 3 sectors are agriculture, and that includes forestry, horticulture, fish farming, rail, and non-commercial heating. Everybody else who can buy red diesel at the moment, that includes power generation, construction, groundworks, haulage, all those industry sectors you can see there, and a lot of other sectors that aren't listed there, all of those sectors will lose their eligibility to use red diesel. So that is a major change for everybody. And you notice in this presentation, if you refer back to the original document itself, the clauses where these elements are stipulated are listed in that little tab on the right hand side. So most sectors of industry will lose their eligibility to use red diesel. Now, the other implication is that because businesses can't buy red diesel with its reduced rate of duty, they've got to buy white diesel. And the side effect of this is that they'll also have to pay full VAT, i.e. 20% VAT, as opposed to 5% VAT on red diesel. Now, in one sense, you can say that doesn't matter because almost all businesses who buy red diesel will be VAT registered, so they'll get that extra 15% back. But it will have a major impact on cash flow. And cash flow in a lot of businesses, especially when the economy is not buoyant, cash flow is critical to most businesses. So there will be cash flow implications for an awful lot of businesses. So let's quantify that first of all. So you're going to lose the right to use red diesel and you're going to have to pay more VAT. So how will that actually affect you? So let's just put it into numbers. So looking at it excluding VAT, first of all, if you are paying £1,000 a month, a week, whatever, for your diesel at the moment, if we're doing this face to face, we'd then ask sort of a show of hands and ask for people to comment on how much they think they're going to be paying in future. The shocking thing is that after these changes, your £1,000 bill is going to go up to almost £2,000. That's why in our advertisement for this event, we were saying diesel is going to become twice as expensive. It's difficult to believe, but it will. If you actually include VAT, then your £1,000 bill will go to over £2,000. And because those numbers are so different, it's worth just having a look at how we did the calculations there. So you can see the numbers here. Red diesel at the moment, the diesel itself costs 36 pence per litre. Your duty on top of that is 11 pence per litre. So the price, we actually did these calculations about 10 days ago. The price then was 47 pence per litre. If you compare that to the white diesel situation, assume the diesel itself is still 36 pence per litre, put 58 pence per litre duty on top of that, and you get a price per litre of 94 pence. 47 pence to 94 pence. That's pretty well 100% increase. If you include VAT on top of that again, it's 128% increase. So these are very dramatic figures. It's going to make a huge difference to an awful lot of businesses. If you depend on diesel, it's one of your major costs, it's going to become twice as expensive once these changes come into place. So when will they come into play? Well, the eligibility will end on the 1st of April 2022. So as of now with the webinar, that's about 18 months away. So some of the, if you like, the fine print that comes with the proposals, and this is one of the most sinister aspects of the new proposals. They relate to the use of red diesel as well as, by implication, its purchase, with some very limited exceptions, which I'll come on to later. You're not even allowed to use the red diesel you've already purchased and that's already in your storage tanks after the 1st of April 2022. which means normally if you're having this kind of change coming in, what you do is you'd stock up on the lower price diesel before you lose eligibility to buy it. You can't do that with these proposals because these proposals say you can't use it. So it's worth just having that point in there, stipulated, clause 5.20, where officers find that vehicles and machinery that have lost their entitlement still have some red diesel market in their fuel supplies. These vehicles and machinery, as well as the fuel, would be liable to be seized. And we're going to come on to more penalties later because I don't know why I'm laughing. They're draconian. They're unbelievable. But we're going to see those a little bit later on. The other point is that biofuels will be attracting the same rate of duty as white diesel. So you might think that biodiesels, because of their better environmental properties, are going to escape. No, they're not. They're going to have the same rate of duty. However, there is one exemption that would apply to a company that generates power and sells it to the balancing market through an aggregator. So this could be a site, for example, that uses backup generators to supply surplus power to the grid. They can still use red diesel. However, this exemption does raise the issue of a site that supplies surplus power to an aggregator maybe 1% of the time. Does that make the site is always eligible to use red diesel? We'd have thought that's unlikely because the wording refers of the proposals refers to the red diesel used to supply the power, not the red diesel used to support the site as a whole. But that's not entirely clear yet. Now, there are some other exemptions as well, and this would be under the title of red diesel that's been purchased legitimately. You can use red diesel after the 1st of April 2022 if you bought it legitimately. And by that, they mean you must have expected to use it all by the 1st of April 2022. It refers to the fuel that is in the equipment's fuel supply. And after consultations with fuel suppliers, we take this to mean that it's fuel in the tanks attached to the equipment, i.e. it would be in a vehicle fuel tank or in a genset's belly tanks. It doesn't include fuel that's in the bulk storage in the site on site. The difficulty with this proposal is that if you actually fall foul of it, or if you think you have legitimate stock, but there's an investigation, the Exchequer's first response, its first action, is to seize or decommission the equipment. And then they quite nicely in the proposal say, if you're found to have legitimate stock and have legitimate reasons for having that stock of red diesel still, the equipment will return to you at no charge. Unfortunately, this sort of ignores the fact that you might have been put out of the business in the meantime because you've not been able to use your equipment. So it's a risky endeavor and it's a risky option to take. So what stays the same with these proposals? Well, there's no proposed change to the actual duty rates for diesel. They'll stay at roughly 58 pence for white diesel and 11 pence for red diesel. Having said that, we all know that the economy is not in a great situation. The government spending has been very high during the COVID crisis. So all it takes for that to change is for the government to change it at the next budget. So that could change as well. So what happens if you don't abide by these changes? What happens if you keep on buying and using red diesel? Well, to say that the government is not messing around is an understatement. The threatened penalties seem utterly excessive, but these are what they are. The extent of the penalties and offences have not been specifically laid out yet, But at the moment, illegal use of red diesel on the road, for example, is currently penalised at twice the value of the duty evaded. So that should give us some kind of indication of the level of fines that might come your way if you use red diesel illegally. So against the penalty, against the company, the government has said that the fuel will be seized, which you can understand that would be fairly typical. The penalties would be levied, maybe at twice the rate of the duty evaded. And that's the key one. Vehicle and all machinery is liable to be seized. And that is critically important because a business that depends on this equipment, losing access to that equipment could be far more financially damaging than actually the fines themselves. There is also provision for penalties against the individual directors of the company, managers of the company, something like that. It just says at the moment an offence may have been committed. So it's a sort of belt and braces approach to turning around and saying, don't use red diesel illegally because the penalties will be severe. So why is the government making these changes, and why is it putting in place such severe penalties? Well, the main reason specified is for environmental protection. Now that coal is effectively a fuel of the past, diesel has become the prime target for environmental campaigners, and that's logical in many ways. Because we can't argue that diesel has no environmental impact. So the government, what it says it's doing is it's reducing the incentives to use diesel, and that strikes us as quite a strange way of putting it, because the reduced rate of duty on red diesel is not necessarily, it is a strange way to say that it's an incentive to use it. It's almost like saying being able to claim VAT back for a business is an incentive to spend more. Well, businesses spend what they have to spend. And just because you can claim VAT back doesn't mean you go and buy everything under the sun. You buy what you need. You buy the diesel you need, and you don't buy more, because even with reduced rate of duty on red diesel, it's still an expensive commodity. However, the government sees it as an incentive to use diesel, and it says it's reducing those incentives. So environmental concerns, that's the main reason for the legislation. They mention it 10 times throughout the consultation document, and they kick off the entire document talking about the government's environmental goals. So that is why it's there. And it says that the exemption for the rail industry is there for environmental reasons as well. It talks about perverse outcomes if they didn't allow the rail industry to continue to use red diesel, because they see rail prices would then go up, and therefore people would stop traveling by rail, freight would stop being shipped by rail, and people would go onto the roads instead, which would create more environmental impact. So the rail industry retains its right to use red diesel. Now, with a little tongue in cheek, I have to say, this has obviously got nothing to do with money. Now, the Exchequer is going to make £1.6 billion a year by restricting the number of businesses that can use red diesel. But they only mention this once in the entire document, and that's in Annex B, tucked away right at the end. So obviously that's not important. It has, a couple of people had commented that, to government spending 1.6 billion isn't a huge amount of money. And I suppose in that sense it isn't, but I don't know. Count a billion here and a billion there, and soon you'd be talking about real money. So what are the problems with these proposals as they stand at the moment? Just, it's worth having a quick discussion on this. The heart of the problem is this use principle. The fact they're saying you can't use red diesel, not that you just can't purchase it anymore. First of all, this is going to be very hard to enforce for the government. It's going to need an army of enforcement officers to check users' stocks, because there are tens of thousands of sites out there that could be using illegal red diesel on the 2nd of April 2022. In our consultations with fuel suppliers, we've heard that the plan for the government is to take its current I wouldn't want to call it an army because I don't think there are that many of them, but the on-road inspectors that check for vehicles using red diesel illegally, put my teeth back in, these inspectors will be moving from an on-road role to an off-road role for checking sites using red diesel illegally, but still there's an awful lot of sites they would need to check. On the other hand, if they said they're going to stop the sale of red diesel to ineligible companies, that would be far easier to enforce because there aren't that many fuel suppliers that need to check on. And of course, they've got the mechanism in place already to restrict sale to ineligible companies. And it strikes us, if they're concerned about the effectiveness of that process for checking red diesel doesn't go to the wrong people, then they could just improve that process instead of introducing this system that seems far more onerous for them. Anyway, that's what they're planning on doing. The other aspect of this use, preventing use of red diesel instead of selling it, is that it's environmentally wasteful. If you've got 5,000 litres of red diesel left as you approach the 1st of April 2022, what are you going to do with it? Because disposing of it is going to be a problem. On the other hand, if you just stop the sale, there wouldn't be any waste because people would just use the red diesel until they lose the right to buy any more, and then they'd use white diesel. The other impact, or one of the other impacts of this use clause, is obviously it's economically very painful. If you do, just apart from the massive change in the amount companies are going to have to pay to use white diesel instead of red diesel, if they have to dispose of any stocks of red diesel, that's expensive for them. You'll have to pay somebody to take it away. You could have it then sold onto the boiler fuel market, but the price of boiler fuel is way less than the price you would have paid already for red diesel. Again, just in our checks at the as we were preparing this webinar, boiler fuel was 28 pence per litre as opposed to 46 pence that you would have paid for red diesel. So it's going to be a really nasty blow for any business that has to dispose of any red diesel at the end of the eligibility period. Two more points on the difficulty with using this idea of stopping people using red diesel as opposed to purchasing it. First of all, it's really logistically complex for anyone to comply because what you really want to do is stop using red diesel on about the 31st of March 2022 and then restock on the 1st of April or 2nd of April 2022. But that will be really difficult to plan properly. Whereas obviously on the other hand, if they just said that you're not allowed to buy it after the 1st of April 2022, that would be there would be no logistical challenge there at all. Then finally, when we were preparing this and discussing the changes, we really do wonder if there's any point, if environmental protection is the point of all these regulations, will this idea of banning the use or restricting the use of red diesel, will it make that much of a difference? And we can't see that it does, because if you've got someone who is a heavy consumer of red diesel, then if they were just not allowed to purchase red diesel in the future, they would very quickly, on about the 10th of April 2022, maybe need to restock, and they'd be using the higher level of duty diesel. They'd be using white diesel. If they were a light consumer of diesel, then yes, it could be the end of 2022 before they actually switched from red diesel to white diesel. But that organization, that light consumer, wasn't doing an awful lot of environmental damage anyway because they were a light user. And if the government is concerned about revenue at the same time, they weren't contributing much to the exchequer anyway. So the whole idea of stopping the use of red diesel instead of its purchase does seem to be a pointless endeavor. Other problems with the proposals as they are, it puts the fuel suppliers, the RDCOs, in a really awkward position. They're required by the proposals not to supply too much red diesel or old red diesel in the period moving up towards the end of eligibility. They're limited to supplying what they think the customer or the RDCO has reason to believe will be used by the 1st of April 2022. But how are they going to judge this? If you're going to your existing supplier, then maybe they could use old invoices. But there again, if you're buying from a new supplier, they won't have that background, that trading history to look back to. You also have the question there, should it be their responsibility to judge this? If you turn around and say that, okay, it's 6 months before the deadline, you use 1,000 litres a month, therefore you order 6,000 litres. If you turn around and say, actually, I want 12,000 litres instead, these are my mitigating circumstances, why my consumption is going to double over the next 6 months, is the RDCO in a position to assess how valid that purchaser's mitigating circumstances are? So it sort of raises the question, that last question there, is it open to abuse? It's not really a question. It is massively open to abuse, this system, and it's going to be very difficult to enforce. So what should people be doing from now? What can you do? Well, the first point we would say is respond to the consultation. And there is very little time to do this. This is why we, in our advertising, we try to make clear this is important to do this soon. It's the 24th of September now. 1st of October is when the consultation finishes. It's been a very short consultation period. There's a template on our website that you can use to make this process as simple as possible. We've put in some information following the theme of this webinar today. So use the parts you agree with and delete the rest. There's no reason why you have to put in the information we've supplied. You can put in your own comments, obviously, but we just want to make it as easy as possible. So what we're suggesting in the document, the parts we've filled in, is we've said the government should restrict the sale of red diesel to non-eligible companies after the 1st of April, not its use. We've also asked for clarification on whether users are required to flush out storage tanks. Suppliers definitely are. Users, not so clear. We also need clarification on what red diesel use is allowed when you supply power to aggregators. We think it's probably only the diesel when you're supplying power to the aggregator, not for the whole site, but that could be clarified. And we also need clarification on how companies are expected to show their consumption level to their fuel suppliers. So that consultation is really important. Otherwise, the proposals will just go through as they are, and that's going to be a very, very uncomfortable situation for a lot of us. Next thing, obviously you need to schedule your orders of red diesel. The goal is to run out on the 31st of March 2022, but unless you've got some mitigating circumstances, your orders have got to conform to usual consumption levels, because the suppliers are not allowed to supply more diesel than they reasonably expect you to consume by 1st of April. You may need to supply past bills to show your typical consumption levels, and if you do want to exceed your consumption levels, you're certainly going to have to show the supplier why you expect your consumption to rise over the next few months. If you still have red diesel in March 2022, you're in a difficult position, because you either need to make sure you've got evidence to say you purchased it legitimately, or you need to plan to dispose of it. And remember, if you're in an investigation from the Exchequer that asks you to show you have that red diesel legitimately, your equipment could be seized while that investigation goes on. So even if it's legitimate, you've got to ask, is it worth the risk? which brings us on to one of the other options you might want to consider. And this one seems really crazy, but we're going to lay it out there anyway. Consider moving to white diesel early. And you start thinking, well, that's absolutely mad because it's so much more expensive. But balance these two things out. On the negative side, you've got the cost of moving to white diesel. It's more expensive. So you think, well, I wouldn't want to do that because it is expensive. On the other hand, weigh that against, if you like, the whole idea of business continuity. You know, it's difficult to put a financial value on it, but there is certainly value in having a company just running smoothly. If you have an investigation, if you get penalties, if you don't get penalties, if you just have the investigation, how much will that damage your business just from the disruption? If you actually have red diesel and you're going to dispose of it, do you actually have people who can organize that disposal with an environmental management company? Do you have people around who can help them with the removal of that red diesel? It's all disruption, it's all extra administration, and you might turn around and say, just don't want any of that. We'll just switch to white diesel early. Other things, new working practices. Diesel is going to become twice as expensive as it is at the moment. So you do want to reduce consumption. So, we've all got cars at the moment. If you have a diesel car, you stop at the traffic lights, it switches itself off. Is there that kind of equivalent on the construction equipment, gensets, etc.? Well, gensets certainly do switch themselves off. There's also the issue of if you have generators running full time for things like security cabins that are, occupied overnight, should you be doing that from a generator, or is there a possibility of using the generators during the daytime when they're active anyway to charge batteries, and then having the maybe lighting towers or having security booths powered from battery power overnight? It's going to be time when we all have to look at ways of reducing diesel consumption. Then obviously the stated aim of the proposals is to reduce the use of diesel. So are there some items of equipment that have a non-diesel alternative? So if we look at power generation, then obviously you can have diesel solar hybrids, diesel wind hybrids, diesel battery hybrid systems. For vehicles, you can have diesel gas biofuel conversions as well. So those are some options that are available for power generation and equipment. The other option, obviously, is when you're looking at your equipment, if you're looking in the near future at replacing equipment, are there some non-diesel versions of the equipment available? There obviously are at the moment. They're starting to emerge. So we just looked at JCB, for example, and you can see certainly for their smaller equipment, there are electric versions available. The downside is they're more expensive to buy. So the mini excavator in the picture costs £215 per week, as opposed to £110 per week for the non-electric version. But once diesel becomes twice as expensive as it is now, what are the running costs of the electric versus the diesel equipment? That would be need to be factored into your considerations. So what we're just going to do now, and because we're not doing this face-to-face, this is quite a strange way of doing it, so we won't be able to have any input, but rather than Q&A, which we're going to have just at the end anyway, we have normally a Q&A, what we call a share and solve system. So we have a series of scenarios, and what we normally do when we run this as a CPD course is we have people just suggesting answers. Now with these, there are no wrong answers. It's normally just a discussion of what would you do. So imagine it's July the 1st, 2021. You need to reorder red diesel. You use 1,000 litres per month. So that's 9 months before the deadline. So what's the most you can order? Well, option 1 would be you order 9,000 litres. You use 1,000 litres a month, 9 months away. That's what you're allowed to order. Another option might be you can turn around and say, I'm going to order 18,000 litres because I can show the fuel supplier and the HMRC reasons why your consumption is going to go up to 2,000 litres. But again, remember, you've got that risk of an investigation. Or your other option could be you're just going to order 5,000 litres because you're being cautious and you're going to make sure that all the red diesel is used well before the 1st of April 2022, so there's no investigations and no disruption to your business. Second scenario, it's March the 21st, 2022, so the deadline is almost upon you. You're a construction company and you've got 7,000 litres, so you've got a big stock of red diesel. What's your next step? Well, option one is uncomfortable, but it could be to have it taken away and disposed of responsibly. So that's going to cost you, and obviously all the money and duty you paid on that red diesel, you're not going to get it back. Second thing, you could rustle up whatever documentation you might have that can show it was purchased legitimately. So you've got that 7 litres left, but there was a very good reason why you expected to use it. Now on that, remember, it might be that you have to face an investigation there, and during that investigation, you might lose access to your equipment. Option 3, and this is, in red, not recommended, but, we've been around a while, so we know some people are going to do this. They're just going to say, we're going to keep on using. What are the chances of getting caught? Probably quite slim, but we cannot say that is a recommended course of action. Final scenario, this would have been a bit of fun if we could do it live. February 7th, 2022, you need to reorder diesel. Your farm uses 500 litres per month. What do you do? And I'm sure everybody watching this has triggered, that's your trick question, because farmers, lucky farmers, they can still buy more red diesel because they're a farm and they're still eligible. So they can use red diesel from now to kingdom come. So thank you very much for that. I've just gone 5 minutes over, so I do apologize. Now I'll just try and take a look at what the questions are. Okay, so here we go with one. Will the 1st of October deadline be extended because 2020 has been so chaotic for everybody? Well, absolutely. Yesterday, before we finalized the presentation, we went back onto the government website to check that the deadline was still the 1st of October, and it was. So there's no indication that it's going to change. And I doubt if it would, simply because they started the consultation process during the COVID. So it's not like COVID suddenly cropped up during the consultation. They hadn't expected it. They started the consultation during COVID. So it was always a factor. So we can't see any chance of the deadline being extended. How many inspectors are there? I'm afraid we don't know that, so I can't answer that question. Are the financial figures correct? Twice as much seems too big a difference. Well, yes. On that, it is one of those, if you like, oddities of statistics. The difference looks big. Saying it's 100% increase looks like a big increase, and that's partly because diesel itself is so, I don't want to say cheap, but diesel prices are so low at the moment. It's 38 pence per litre. If diesel was 58 pence per litre, if it was 60 pence per litre, then duty would proportionally be lower. So the increase in price in that situation might only be, say, it's a 70% increase. So yes, the figures are correct, but the fact that it says it's going to be twice as much, that would be affected by how expensive diesel itself is. If diesel goes up, then the price increase might only be 90% increase. Either way, though, I think the point we all will take away from that is that it's going to be a massive price increase for everybody who uses diesel. Okay, so that appears to be all the questions. So I thank everybody. And if you have any more questions, then if you just use our standard email address, sales@optimumpowerservices.com, we'll obviously respond as fast as we can. Thank you very much indeed.